Part 3, The Passive Revolution in India. In a chapter published in 2012, 2 years before the Hindu nationalist right-wing populist Narendra Modi was elected prime minister, titled Democracy and Capitalism in India, Pursuing Two Tocquevillian Themes, Partha Chatterjee sketches the dynamics of class power and democracy in two successive periods in post-colonial India. First, the period from the 1950s through the 1980s, and then the period since. What emerges from this periodization is an account in some ways very different from the narrative of democracy and capitalism as told when the experience of the rich countries at the core of the capitalist world system is centered, as it is in the work of Streeck and Fraser. Chatterjee draws on the work of Sudipta Kaviraj, who used Antonio Gramsci's idea of the passive revolution, corresponding to a block dialectic, to describe the dynamics of class domination in the first decades of post-colonial India, a framework according to which power had to be shared between the dominant classes because no class had the ability to exercise hegemony on its own. According to Chatterjee, the characteristic features of the passive revolution in India were the relative autonomy of the state as a whole from the bourgeoisie and the landed elites, the supervision of the state by an elected political leadership, a permanent bureaucracy, and an independent judiciary, the negotiation of class interests through a multi-party electoral system, a protectionist regime discouraging the entry of foreign capital and promoting import substitution, the leading role of the state sector in heavy industry, infrastructure, transport, telecommunications, mining, banking, and insurance, state control over the private manufacturing sector through a regime of licensing, and the relatively greater influence of industrial capitalists over the central government and that of the landed elites on the state governments. Chatterjee continues by pointing out that passive revolution was a form that was marked by its difference from classical bourgeois democracy. But to the extent that capitalist democracy as established in Western Europe or North America served as the normative standard of bourgeois revolution, discussions of passive revolution in India carried with them the sense of a transitional system from pre-colonial and colonial regimes to some yet to be defined authentic modernity. Alongside the Gramscian idea of passive revolution, Chatterjee employs the Marxist category of primitive accumulation to help think through the terms of the alleged transition from traditional agrarian to modern industrial society. Chatterjee reminds us that against the rosy accounts of classical political economists, Marx had stressed that the key feature of the so-called primitive accumulation was the disassociation of the laborer from the means of labor, from the means of production. In the Indian context, Chatterjee contends instead of the leading role of a dynamic capitalist class, it was the state of the passive revolution that undertook the task of political management of primitive accumulation. Even so, Chatterjee maintains the sharing of power with other dominant classes placed definite constraints on the process of capitalist development. The modern sectors did expand, but traditional sectors, characterized by the persistence of institutions such as caste and religious loyalties and patron-client relations, often adapted to the requirements of modern electoral mobilization, were remarkably resistant. This dual system basically remained in place up through the 1980s. However, a series of cumulative changes gradually created the precondition for the emergence of a new political framework. These changes included, first, the spread of governmental technologies as a result of the deepening reach of the developmental state under conditions of electoral democracy, which meant that the state was now no longer an external entity to the peasant community. Second, reform since the 1950s in the structure of agrarian property, even though gradual and piecemeal, meant that except in isolated areas, for the first time in centuries, small peasants possessing land no longer directly confronted an exploiting class within the village as under feudal or semi-feudal conditions. Third, since the tax on land or agricultural produce was no longer a significant source of revenue for the government as in colonial or pre-colonial times, the relation of the state to the peasantry was no longer directly extractive, as it often was in the past. Fourth, with the rapid growth of cities and industrial regions, the possibility of peasants making a shift to urban and non-agricultural occupations was no longer a function of their pauperization and forcible separation from the land, but was often a voluntary choice shaped by the perception of new opportunities and new desires. And fifth, with the spread of school education and widespread exposure to modern communications, media such as the cinema, television, and advertising, there was a strong and widespread desire among younger members, both male and female, of peasant families, not to live the life of a peasant in the village, and instead to move to the town or the city, with all its hardships and uncertainties, because of its lure of anonymity and upward mobility. Alongside these changes in the countryside, Chatterjee contends there were changes in transnational norms of governance. Specifically, there had emerged by the 1990s a growing sense that certain basic conditions of life must be provided to people everywhere, and that if the national or local governments could not provide them, someone else must, whether it was other states or international agencies or non-governmental organizations. This meant in a nutshell that the ongoing and even accelerating process of primitive accumulation came to be accompanied by a parallel process of the reversal of the effects of primitive accumulation. Chatterjee stresses in particular the development of several governmental technologies which became widespread in the second half of the 20th century and had the effect of softening the blows dealt by primitive accumulation. Among these, for example, there are many examples of government and non-government agencies offering easy loans to enable those without the means of sustenance to find some gainful employment. Such loans are often advanced without serious concern for profitability or the prospect of the loan being repaid, since the money advanced here is not driven by the motive of further accumulation of capital, but rather by that of providing the livelihood needs of the debtors, that is to say, by the motive of reversal of the effects of primitive accumulation. Likewise, government agencies provide some direct benefits to people who, because of poverty or other reasons, are unable to meet their basic consumption needs. Even so, crucially, except in certain marginal pockets, peasant and crafts production in India today is fully integrated into a market economy. Since the 1990s, as Chatterjee goes on to sketch, there has been a transformation in the passive revolution state. According to Chatterjee, the crucial difference consists in the dismantling of the license regime, greater entry of foreign capital and foreign consumer goods, and the opening up of sectors such as telecommunications, transport, infrastructure, mining, banking, insurance, among others, to private capital. Corresponding with this, and with the rise of the information technology industry, alongside consistent growth in manufacturing, there has come a distinct ascendancy in the relative power of the corporate capitalist class as compared to the landed elites. At the same time, the dismantling of the license regime has opened up a new field of competition between state governments to woo capitalist investment, both domestic and foreign. Moreover, although the state continues to be the most important mediating apparatus in negotiating between conflicting class interests, the autonomy of the state in relation to the dominant classes appears to have been redefined, significantly weakened. Nevertheless, Chatterjee insists, it would be a mistake to think of the convergence of the Indian political system with the classic models of capitalist democracy. The critical difference he maintains has been produced by a split in the field of the political between a domain of properly constituted civil society and a more ill-defined and contingently activated domain of political society. Indeed, according to Chatterjee, civil society in India today, peopled largely by the urban middle classes, is the sphere that seeks to be congruent with the normative models of bourgeois civil society and represents the domain of capitalist hegemony. If this were the only relevant political domain, then India today would probably be indistinguishable from other Western capitalist democracies. However, he continues, there is the other domain of what he calls political society that includes larger sections of the rural population and the urban poor. These people do, of course, have the formal status of citizens and can exercise their franchise as an instrument of political bargaining. But he contends they do not relate to the organs of the state in the same way that the middle classes do, nor do governmental agencies treat them as proper citizens belonging to civil society. In a nutshell, for Chatterjee, the framework of passive revolution is still valid for India, but its structure and dynamic have undergone a change. The capitalist class, he insists, has come to acquire a position of moral political hegemony over civil society, consisting principally of the urban middle classes. Moreover, and this point is crucial, it exercises its considerable influence over both the central and the state governments, not through electoral mobilization of political parties and movements, but largely through the bureaucratic managerial class, the increasingly influential print and visual media, and the judiciary and other independent regulatory bodies. Meanwhile, Chatterjee continues, the integration with the market has meant that large sections of what used to be called the subsistence economy, which was once the classic description of small peasant agriculture, have now come fully under the sway of capital. At the same time, population growth groups ranging from street vendors, illegal squatters, and others whose habitation or livelihood verge on the margins of legality stand outside of civil society, constituting political society. These people are not regarded by the state as proper citizens possessing rights. To the contrary, they are seen to belong to particular population groups with specific empirically established and statistically described characteristics, which are targets of particular governmental policies. Interestingly, Chatterjee suggests, even though the claims made by different groups in political society are for governmental benefits, these cannot often be met by the standard application of rules and frequently require the declaration of an exception. Chatterjee explicitly contrasts this political method in Indian democracy to making allowance for special cases, mostly involving groups with only a local presence and little influence in the central corridors of power, with the legislative interventions by special interests in the United States characterized by professional lobbying and the introduction of a myriad of minor clauses in small print into the body of the law. Meanwhile, Chatterjee adds, mobilizations in political society are often premised on the strategic manipulation of relative electoral strengths rather than on the expectation of commanding a majority. Indeed, the frequently spectacular quality of actions in political society, including the resort to violence, he claims, is a sign of the ability of relatively small groups of people to make their voices heard and to register their claims with governmental agencies. Moreover, he concludes, the activities of political society represent a continuing critique of the paradoxical reality in all capitalist democracies of equal citizenship and majority rule on the one hand, and the dominance of property and privilege on the other. However, those subaltern groups incapable of exercising strategic leverage of electoral mobilization find themselves utterly marginalized, representing an outside beyond the boundaries of political society. Finally, Chatterjee emphasizes that an important difference represented by activities in political society when compared to the movements of democratic mobilization familiar to us from 20th century Indian history is its lack of a perspective of transition. Chatterjee concludes by providing a summary diagnosis. He argues that with the continuing rapid growth of the Indian economy, the hegemonic hold of corporate capital over the domain of civil society is likely to continue. This, he insists, will inevitably mean continued primitive accumulation. That is to say, there will be more and more primary producers, peasants, artisans, and petty manufacturers who will lose their means of production. Nevertheless, he continues, most of these victims of primitive accumulation are unlikely to be absorbed in the new growth sectors of the economy. They will be marginalized and rendered useless as far as the sectors dominated by corporate capital are concerned. Even so, he contends, the passive revolution under conditions of electoral democracy makes it unacceptable and illegitimate for the government to leave these marginalized populations without the means of labor to simply fend for themselves. That carries the risk of turning them into the dangerous classes. Hence, he surmises, a whole series of governmental policies are being and will be devised to reverse the effects of primitive accumulation. Chatterjee's diagnosis does much to decenter the Eurocentric analysis of the evolving relationship between capitalism and democracy in crisis accounts such as those of Streeck and Fraser. Unfortunately, Chatterjee's analysis was published 2 years before the election of the Hindu nationalist right-wing populist Narendra Modi to the office of the Prime Minister. It would be, of course, interesting to explore how these most disturbing, more recent developments fit into Chatterjee's framework of the evolving passive revolution state. In this regard, his most recent intervention, his 2019 book, I Am the People, Reflections on Popular Sovereignty Today, which provides a non-Eurocentric genealogy of the populist state, in which the Gramscian concept of the passive revolution plays a prominent role yet again, would seem well worth checking out. And with this, we will take another break.